All right, babes, here we go. Is Christy Carlson Romano culty? For those of you that don't know, Christy Carlson Romano was recently called forward by Alexa Nicholas, that one right there from Zoe 101, for some problematic behaviors and for platforming some alleged predators, potentially predatory people on Christy Carlson Romano's podcast, Vulnerable. Alexa's recent video about it sent me on kind of a rabbit hole about Christy Carlson Romano, along with a lot of people's comments on a couple of TikToks I made about it. So we're going to deep dive on Christy and this empire that she's built off of millennial nostalgia, and if she's maybe exhibiting some of the characteristics of being like a culty leader or a culty guru that she may have picked up from her days of being a child star and being in the industry. My intention with this series is not to call Christy a bad person or even call her out, but more so to call her forward and to also hopefully teach you guys a little bit about cult dynamics and what the imbalance of power could look like and potentially toxic or bad leadership in pop culture and like social media in general. I also wanted to make this series to provide some more like information to people because I feel like some of these things that we're going to talk about throughout the series has been swept under the rug. And I think as an audience that we deserve informed consent when we choose to follow someone or look up to someone, especially someone that we really know from our childhood when something so emotional such as nostalgia is involved. So let's dive in to Christy Carlson Romano. Really quickly, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Cassie Marie, no culty vibes or at the Cassie Marie on all the socials. I am a former cult hopper who has spent the last couple of years and probably indefinitely learning everything that I can find out about cults. And now I am a content creator and love sharing all of those things that I learned with all of you guys. I really like to make comparisons between cults and pop culture and draw similarities so that we can see similar tactics of undue influence or coercive control in the systems that we all live in and are a part of every day. And I also love learning about cult healing. I am an artist. I share my art journey sometimes here as well. So if you're interested in cult and pop culture, like, subscribe, follow, comment wherever you are, wherever you're hearing this or watching this, if you want to see more. If you don't know who Christy Carlson Romano is, she was a child star. She started on Broadway when she was around 6 years old. And then she was a Disney star who was best known for her role as Ren on Even Stevens, as the voice of Kim Possible, and also for her role as Captain Jennifer Stone in Cadet Kelly with Hilary Duff. Christy has now built somewhat of an internet empire off of millennial nostalgia and talking about being a child star and how that has affected her life as an adult. It was actually through Christy Carlson Romano's podcast called Vulnerable that I started making a lot of connections between growing up as a child star and being raised in a cult. There were so many similarities that I picked up from her interviews with people like Allison Stoner and Alexa Nicholas. Recently, Allison Stoner released a podcast and YouTube series called Dear Hollywood, where they dig into what it was like growing up as a child star and some things that we can do to hopefully prevent some of the harms that have been caused to child stars in the past. It was through this series that I started seeing like a lot more direct connections and just absolutely glaring similarities between what it's like being in a cult and what it's like being a child star. Things like feeling separated or being separated from reality or society. When you're in a cult, you're sometimes removed from society and being able to relate to a diverse group of people. You're not able to relate to normal peers your age and society. You only relate to people within your group or cult. And similarly, as a child star, you are often too famous to go to school or relate to other kids your age, and it causes a lot of problems and you can feel really isolated. Cults will try their best to really isolate you. Sometimes child stars even would be isolated from like friends or family or extended family, and only have a close core group of people and managers that they even interact with on a daily basis. In a cult, they really discourage individuality. You are expected to take on a cult identity and not have an identity of your own. And Allison described that child stars often have a hard time forming their own identity because they take on the identity of characters in some of their most formative years when they usually would be developing a sense of self. So in both cases, they have a hard time developing a sense of self, which can really affect you into adulthood, especially if you're doing that like in your 20s or 30s. Cult members and child stars also similarly are always striving for this sense of purity and perfection. In cults, they usually demand that you follow the rules of the group and be the best version of yourself and the best person that you can be by following their rules or doctrine. And it creates this loop of shame because none of us can be perfect and ever reach all of those demands. And it keeps you dependent on the cult. And as a child star, you're often always working on skills that will make you more desirable in auditions. You're always trying to perfect your craft or learn something new or double down on things that you're kind of already known for. But again, you will never be perfect enough, and you face so much rejection from so many auditions that it can also create a shame spiral where you feel like you're never doing enough, and then you're constantly relying on the validation of adults or the industry to survive. Daniela Mestinick-Young, who is a scholar of cults and extreme groups and who was raised in the Children of God cult herself, talks about how cults always come down to labor. Dr. Janja Lalich, who is also a cult scholar, talks about this so much that cults are basically just based on getting labor for free, and children in cults are always made to labor for free at a very, very early age, very inappropriately and very different from children, what we should expect from children developmentally, number one, and from children in the rest of society. And again, child stars, while there are some rules in place for like film stars or television child stars, that by the way still aren't in place for like child influencers or child reality stars, they're made to labor from a young age at inappropriate developmental levels. And when you factor in auditions and not rehearsals, but like I said before, the fact that they're always trying to learn new skills or improve on new skills, and that even looking for jobs becomes a full-time job and you're not getting paid for looking for jobs, that is also free labor for an industry. And the last thing I'm going to talk about for purposes of this series, I will do a whole nother big series on the similarities between children who grew up in cults and child stars. But for this, if the child is harmed or abused in cults or in Hollywood, it is often covered up. It is often not talked about. The child is so often not protected, and justice usually is not served. Cults and cult-like systems will always protect themselves and cover up abuse instead of dealing with it, facing it, and serving justice. I laid that whole foundation for you because that's the environment that Christy Carlson Romano grew up in. She talks about it a lot in a lot of her content. She used to make YouTube videos where she talks about it a lot. She's made episodes of her podcast where she kind of airs out her trauma and her traumatic experiences that she faced while in the industry and when she left. Like I said earlier, Christy Carlson Romano actually started on Broadway at around 6 years old, and then just through Broadway and auditions ended up on Disney Channel as Ren on Even Stevens, as the voice of Kim Possible in Cadet Kelly, and she did a couple of other things as well, and then had a break for a little while and ended up with a role as Belle in Beauty and the Beast on Broadway. In between Disney and Beauty and the Beast, Christy Carlson Romano did go to college, but she found it to be a really difficult experience. She didn't do well socially, not like she didn't get along with people, but she had a really difficult time with a peer group, which wouldn't be surprising because she never really learned what it was like to be in a peer group in a social setting when she was a child. Then as Beauty and the Beast was ending, she really started feeling some of the consequences of the cult-like environment she grew up in. After Christy Carlson Romano wrapped up playing Belle in Beauty and the Beast on Broadway, she started realizing that she may not have a job with Disney or on Disney Channel anymore. She was, I think, around 20 or 21 years old and was realizing that she was too old to play a lot of the leading roles or any of the kids on Disney Channel, but she was still too young to play any of their parents. And there aren't really many roles with that company that are in between. Christy said she drank a lot and she felt directionless and unable to navigate life on her own terms and was in an incredibly vulnerable place, not really knowing what she's supposed to do because she thought she would only make more and more money, as she was told by people that worked for her and by people that she worked for. And she never thought she would have to plan for life after Disney. She even said that Disney Channel would call them a family. Her and a lot of her co-stars in Disney, like they were all in the Disney family, which cults will also often do. When you make the group a family more emotional than just a group that you're a part of, people are usually willing to self-sacrifice to a higher level, and cults always require more and more self-sacrifice. Christy also described in a BuzzFeed News article that she felt angry during this time because she felt like she had put in a lot of work and a lot of effort her whole life as a child star, and that she should be successful and she should only have an upward trajectory from there. And she said she was left in kind of this narcissistic purgatory, is what she was quoted as describing it as. And again, that left her in a very vulnerable position. Christy described that around this time, she was also scammed out of tens of thousands of dollars from a psychic who was supposedly helping her figure out where to go from there and what her life was going to be like, and was always giving her positive affirmations and telling her she needed to buy different crystals to have different successes and do different things. She says she's still really, really ashamed of this and ashamed of not managing her finances better, which reminds me so much of the coaching industry. That's one of the cults that I was part of. And that's something that's still hard for me to talk about, is how many tens of thousands of dollars. I only spent like tens of thousands of dollars. It was more than 10, less than 20. But it's hard when you feel bamboozled and you spent a lot of money on something that ultimately helped you, either didn't help you at all or made your life a lot worse. So around 26 years old, Christy says she decided it was time to go back to school. The BuzzFeed article said that she went to Columbia University, but in a Texas Monthly article, it says that she went back to the college that she went to in between Disney Channel and Beauty and the Beast, which was Barnard College. But this is where Christy met her husband, Brendan Rooney. According to the Texas Monthly article, Brendan Rooney was going to Columbia University and was taking some kind of film class at Barnard College, and he was there on his GI Bill from being in the Marines. And if you know anything about Daniela Mestinick-Young, who I mentioned earlier in this series, she draws parallels between the Children of God cult that she was raised in and the army that she joined when she left the Children of God cult, and talks about how the army, and specifically deployment in the army, was really, really similar to her cult experience. And being in the military can be similar to being in a cult. And I think it's like this known, unknown thing that the Marines are the cultiest branch of the military. And Christy was quoted in an article saying that their baggage was surprisingly similar and their life experiences lined up more than she thought, which makes perfect sense to me because they were both extremely culty. So Christy and Brendan both went to school for some kind of film something. I can't remember exactly what their degrees were, but they both wanted to Christy get back into the industry, and Brendan was interested in film and interested in getting into the industry. They tried a bunch of different things. Christy specifically, she even worked like as an internship for Disney for a while, which she said was incredibly awkward when executives would see her and be like, "Oh, aren't you?" And she'd be like, "Yeah." It was weird, but nothing really stuck until they discovered the world of millennial nostalgia. Christy says she noticed she had a huge fan base online that was interested in where she was after Disney Channel and what she was doing. and that there was a huge business in Comic-Con and former child stars traveling around and meeting with their fan bases. So she took to social media to kind of build a personal brand, especially when they were having their first daughter and they really needed to figure out what they were going to do to build a life together. Christy launched her YouTube channel in 2019 with Christy's Kitchen Throwbacks, where she cooked different meals and combined meal times with child stars, and she would do that with other former child stars. She said that they did pretty well, but they didn't do as well as she had hoped. She dabbled in a lot of different kind of content, like makeup videos and challenges, and even tried family vlogging for a minute, but thankfully decided to keep her children out of the spotlight. That would have been another extremely culty route that she possibly would have gone down. I would probably be super critical if that is what she chose, because that would 100% just be going into the same exact system that she's come out of and been critical of. Then Christy and Brendan moved to Austin, Texas in 2020, like right after the height of the pandemic or right around the height of the pandemic, and started doing these videos where she would walk, like go on hikes around Austin, Texas, and talk about her past. She would share difficult and vulnerable topics like things titled like The Truth About Disney Channel or Why Shia LaBeouf and I Don't Talk Anymore. And that video where she mentioned Shia LaBeouf was one of her highest performing videos and had a couple million views on YouTube. And these more vulnerable videos started actually getting her attention from tabloids like the Daily Mail, and she started kind of getting more on the radar at this point. Now, Christy was the one sharing all of her life trauma, but says that her husband, Brendan, was kind of the brains behind the operation, and he was the one kind of trying to forecast trends and coming up with the titles that some people really criticized as clickbaity, which we're going to talk about a little bit more later, but she often says that Brendan is really the brains behind a lot of this. Christy also started finding a lot of success on TikTok. Like right around this time or right after this, I started following her because of a lot of these vulnerable conversations on TikTok. And she started 2 podcasts, one with Will, I don't know how you say his name, if it's like Friedel or Friedel, who was Ron Stoppable on Kim Possible and also was Eric in Boy Meets World. They have a like voiceover animation themed podcast. And then she started her podcast Vulnerable, that I also mentioned early at the beginning of this series, where I started really seeing more of the connections between cults and growing up as a child star. So Christy's really finding this niche of kind of exposing her own trauma and sharing that with the world with the Vulnerable podcast. And she really leans into the millennial nostalgia and like exposing secrets. And her and Brendan founded Podco, which is a podcasting production company, I think you would call it. And this hosts a lot of throwback podcasts now, like a Wizards of Waverly Place rewatch podcast, a Ned's Declassified rewatch podcast, Boy Meets World. Do they do Boy Meets World? The Lawrence brothers have a throwback podcast. There's like a ton of them. In a Vulture article released in May of 2023, Christy says that she's not afraid of being seen as a cringy millennial or using clickbaity titles to get attention to her videos, because she hopes that when people get there, they will learn more about the difficulties that child stars face. And she hopes to unpack more in her content to bring attention to that issue while people are watching. However, not everybody agrees with the motive behind why Christy is doing all of this. One of the BuzzFeed articles I read even said, what is Christy gonna do when she has no more trauma left to share? And I think we're starting to see some more of what might be an ulterior motive behind all of this. Some people have been questioning Christy's authenticity and motives from the beginning of her resurgence into the public eye. Many wonder if she cares more about clicks and views and money than bringing awareness to the difficulties child stars face. and more than she cares about healing and moving forward. Others think that she is really well-intentioned and she does want to help, but she's maybe playing out the systems that she essentially was raised in, and systems and power dynamics and types of influence and control that she has not yet deconstructed from. I was initially super on board with Christy bringing awareness to these systems and power dynamics because I heard about a lot of it through her. And to be honest, I'm pretty naive. I've learned how to find red flags, and I'm going to talk about some of them that I've seen in Christy, but I wanted to believe the best because she did bring some things to my awareness, and I like to believe the best in people. One of the first things I noticed that made me a little curious and a little cautious was how ready Christy seemed to be to work for some of these companies that she was in a way speaking out against, but again, she would very clearly try to say that she wasn't speaking out against these companies. I heard her talk about it on her Vulnerable podcast a couple of times. And even as I was reading some of these articles, she was very careful to say that she doesn't want to be seen as a whistleblower or a disgruntled ex-star. And that if the opportunity for a reboot came, she would be open to the idea. And I thought that was just kind of odd to want to jump right into while you're claiming to advocate for change. And I just don't think that an activist or an advocate would work for a company that's not actively changing. And she used to say things like if the conditions were right. So I assumed that meant if they were making active changes, and she might have, but it was just a little bit of a red flag because it also felt like maybe she didn't care. This was from a BuzzFeed article, and this is where she's quoted, and she said that she was nervous that she would come off as bitter or a whistleblower, and she said she still believes in the wholesomeness of what Disney represents. I don't think that I would ever speak negatively about Disney or even Disney Channel, she said. She added that she would jump at the chance to do a reboot if the project felt right. I am always willing to do the work and work hard for Disney. That last quote specifically felt like something someone would say who was still pretty indoctrinated into a system of belief. You don't see stars like Jeanette McCurdy or Alexa Nicholas jumping at the chance to work for Nickelodeon again. And I know that Disney and Nickelodeon were a little different in the abuses they perpetuated. So I also kind of wrote it off as that. I was like, Disney isn't always bad, but it was still as bad. Child stars still do experience a lot of trauma and indoctrination and all kinds of things. And a true activist wouldn't want to jump at the chance to work hard for that, again, without some acknowledgement of a desire to change. Another kind of weird red flag is Christy saying that she wants her brand to be rooted in authenticness, but always monetizing. So she's just showing a clear motive for monetization. And don't get me wrong, as creators, we want to monetize, right? We want to be monetizing. But when you're talking about difficult or traumatic topics, monetization should not be a primary driver in that conversation. And this alone might not be that big of a red flag depending on how you look at it. Some of you might think it really is. Some of you might think it's not. But she talks about how her husband is really a lot of the brains behind her titles and what she posts and what she talks about. And again, when you're talking about your own trauma, I just think that someone who hasn't experienced that, someone who didn't grow up as a child star, being a large voice in dictating what gets shared or what gets talked about could potentially be harmful or difficult. And then the other thing about talking about leading with authenticity but monetizing is you then actually have to be authentic and honest. And when Christy was talking to the journalist with BuzzFeed, she said that her walking around the trails of Austin, Texas videos were 99% of the time not scripted, but her publicist declined to let the person writing the article, the journalist, couldn't think of journalist, really, wouldn't let them observe Christy filming a video. So you just have to wonder how truthful is she really being? Also, while Christy talked about kind of the cringe and clickbaitiness of her videos that she claims should be authentic and when you're sharing trauma, she basically said that that's the only way to get noticed. And then she was like, oh, well, it's not the only way, it's the quickest way. And it's not the only way to get noticed. There are other ways that you could potentially go about it, but it is the quickest way. And so again, that seemed that there's a pattern forming here. And also when it comes to her husband being part of this and being the brains behind it, I do remember her saying in one of her podcasts, actually a podcast maybe she did with someone else in an interview, that her husband kind of scoffed at her and said that her issues as a child star were silly compared to like what he dealt with as a Marine in the military. And again, this could go either way. Part of me felt like sometimes when you're dealing with trauma that feels so unique to you, that you feel so alone in, when someone kind of snaps you out of it to be like, you're not as special as you think you are, you're not as unique as you think you are, it can make you realize that a lot of people have traumas that can relate to yours, even if it's not textbook exactly the same, and that can be good and that can make you feel less alone. But depending on how it's said or the context of how it's delivered, it can also be really dismissive. In reality, their traumas actually are super similar. And so for him to say like his is worse or his is more intense or what she dealt with is nothing compared to what he dealt with makes me wonder how much he empathizes with her and other child stars who she platforms on her podcast. The Texas Monthly article that I keep referencing in particular was kind of hilariously critical of Christy and her platform and kind of millennial nostalgia and millennial nostalgia creators in general. Like at one point, the journalist said that she basically appeals to emotionally stunted millennials that like can't move past their past. And she seemed to clock Christy as someone hungry for money and notoriety. A quote from the article, she says, maybe she's at the mercy of the Hollywood system. Like I said in the beginning, some people think like maybe she's just perpetuating the system, or maybe she's playing millennials like a fiddle. And they seem to think that there might be a bit more calculation behind it. In this article, Christy described to the journalist that she is really strategic and planned about most of her content. She says she has pages and pages of analytics that her and Brendan look at for every video, every topic, every like traumatic or vulnerable thing that they talk about. They analyze every single bit of it and know exactly what people want and exactly what people are looking for. So how authentic can you be and how in the moment can you be and genuine can you be if you are so very strategically planning every single thing? It would be very culty of her to be controlling information or to be disingenuous about the intentions behind what she's doing. But with all of this information in particular, there's not really like proof of anything. There's no proof she has bad intentions or proof she has authentic intentions. We really could go either way with it and find things to support our theory either way. But then some scandals started surfacing. Alexa Nicholas was an actress on Zoe 101. She has a YouTube channel called Alexa Nicholas, and she also has a, I believe, nonprofit organization called Eat Predators, where she protests predators and enablers of predators, and specifically in LA, businesses, corporations, companies that use NDAs to silence survivors and not let people tell their stories. I highly recommend to follow Alexa and Eat Predators on all socials and on YouTube. And the next few things that I'm going to talk about come from a couple of Alexa's videos. When Alexa frames the next few really problematic, honestly, behaviors that we're going to talk about, she talks about how important it is when you claim to be advocating for and platforming survivors, you need to be the same person behind the scenes as you are in front of everyone else. And you need to be the same person when you're making money as you are when you're not making money. Because when survivors are sharing their stories, a lot of times they're not making money doing so, and they are risking a lot to come onto your platform and tell their story, and for someone to be using their trauma to get clicks or to get attention without giving the survivors all the care that they need and that they deserve can be really harmful, can re-traumatize survivors, can promote harmful narratives to the rest of the people, which is very harmful to the work that needs to be done in order to get justice for these survivors. It's a whole thing. And Alexa basically was like, who is Christy when she's not making money? And my question is, who is Christy when she's not speaking to us on social media? To the best of my knowledge, this all started when Christy Carlson Romano had Corey Feldman on her Vulnerable podcast. Corey Feldman was a child star in the 80s who was a victim of horrible abuse that he alleges against some very specific people, but Corey Feldman is also an alleged predator. And Christy had to have known about these allegations because Corey Feldman mentioned them in this interview that was published to everyone. The interview has since been taken down, but you can listen to snippets of it on Alexa's YouTube video where she talks about this. A friend of one of Corey Feldman's accusers/survivors reached out to Christy Carlson Romano because they were a fan of hers, and they reached out to her in good faith just to basically be like, hey, he has, allegedly done these horrible things to my friend. They didn't say allegedly, they said like, this is what's happening. It's happened to multiple women. And in fact, like if any of us were to just Google these allegations, you can find them, read about them. It's multiple people. And she basically asked Christy to consider the survivors and to please take this down. And Christy Carlson Romano read the message and left the survivor's friend on red. Just didn't respond. So they reached out to her one more time in good faith. And again, Christy read it and didn't respond. When I think about these two things together, I think about the term safe pointing. And this is something that Scientology does very well. And I think the term comes from Scientology, but other cults will do this too, where you basically make friends with certain people in power or certain people in the community, and you manipulate them. You make them think like you're a really great person or you do really great things. Like Scientology donates a lot of money to the LAPD, and they hire off-duty LAPD officers to work some of their events so that the LAPD thinks, wow, Scientology is this great organization. So when you are accused of something, they are going to generally side with Scientology versus whoever else. And Corey Feldman kind of talking to Christy in this podcast about being accused of things online, in my mind, is super culty and manipulative, and in a way a form of safe pointing, so that when the survivor's friend reached out to Christy, she just didn't even, I don't know what she believed or didn't believe, or if she was just trying to side with Corey Feldman, but she didn't even respond to the concerns, which is really problematic. So this survivor's friend then reached out to Alexa because she knew what Alexa's nonprofit does and what they protest and how she talks about enablers and how she talked about that on Christy's podcast. And Alexa had not listened to the podcast episode and just thought, oh my gosh, Christy must not have this information. That really sucks that she left you on red. This must be a misunderstanding. And she reached out to Christy about it. And Christy admitted that she left the survivor's friend on red. And they basically had a conversation about it. And Christy was just like, sorry, there's nothing I can do. Can't take down the episode, whatever. So then Alexa described how hurtful that was to her for her to be sharing a platform with an alleged predator, and potentially someone enabling an alleged predator, and how she literally spoke about how that works on the same platform, and how as a survivor, you're often ignored and not believed and left on red so many times, and people only want to hear your story when as Alexa puts it, when your trauma is trending. And when your trauma is not trending, it is really, really hard for people to understand what happened to you and for people to believe you. And so to be on a platform that you're sharing with someone who's doing that and an alleged predator and all those things can be really harmful to the other survivors you have on that platform. I was going to play you some of what the survivor's friend said to Christy and some more of what Alexa said, but it's quite long, and honestly, I would rather you go to Alexa's YouTube to hear exactly what the survivor's friend sent to Christy. Now, a bunch of other people online noticed that Christy had this episode with Corey Feldman and knew about the allegations. And so eventually a bunch of people started calling her out online and posting on Reddit and Twitter, I think, and TikTok and all these places. And eventually she did take this down. And since Christy had to be pushed so hard to take it down and didn't listen to Alexa or the survivor's friend, Alexa asked that she donate some of the proceeds, the money that Christy made off of Alexa's episode that Alexa didn't make off of her episode with Christy, but Christy made off of it. Alexa asked her to donate it to a survivor's nonprofit called Cave. But Alexa realized that Christy took Corey Feldman's episode down, and because people were calling Christy out online, and Alexa was now calling Christy out publicly as well because she was not listening to her text messages, Christy also took Alexa's episode down, which is a total culty power move. Christy was also allegedly blocking people and deleting comments when people were trying to bring this to her attention, and that is a form of information control, and that can be extremely culty as well. Alexa's episode of the Vulnerable podcast, I know, reached a lot of people and was really, really important and valuable information. And I think taking that down and basically punishing Alexa for taking this public when Christy wouldn't listen to her privately is very manipulative. Then, I'm not sure exactly where this happened in the timeline. I'm guessing it was right before this whole Corey Feldman thing happened or before Alexa took it public when Christy was still speaking to her. There was a situation with the Ned's Declassified Rewatch podcast, which is one of the nostalgia podcasts produced by Podco, owned by Christy and her husband. There was a promotional clip flying around TikTok and Instagram where Lindsay Shaw, who used to be really close with Alexa, basically said that she got into a fight with Alexa's mom, like a fist fight with her, and like called her a bitch or something, and really misrepresented a situation that happened when they were kids with Alexa's mom that put her mom in a really bad light and was just also kind of weird and inappropriate. So Alexa reached out to Christy about that clip, which was also slanderous because it was not true, and Lindsay knew it was not the whole truth. Alexa reached out to Christy just to basically say, hey, this was kind of gross and hurtful. Is there anything we can do about this? Can we take it down? And Christy did apologize for this, but while Christy did apologize to Alexa for the clip that was going around where Lindsay was framing a situation that she had with Alexa's mom in a really bad, potentially defamatory, slanderous light. And she did say that she would take that clip, the promotional clip, down, but she could not take down the full episode. And Alexa basically was like, okay, I get it. Like, it's not that big of a deal. It just really hurt my feelings. And I was surprised, since you had me on your podcast and like I'm a friend of the pod, that you wouldn't like ask me about the situation first and that it would be used as like a promotional clip when that's like not even true. It just kind of hurt my feelings. I would appreciate an apology from the Ned's Declassified cast because I don't know why Lindsay said that. And if you're confused about what I'm talking about, you can watch Alexa's video on this on her YouTube. But in response to that, Christy was like, no, sorry, I don't think that's going to happen. I'm not going to ask them to apologize, and they probably won't. So that made me feel weird too. Like, what aren't you saying? What aren't you sharing? It feels like she's really manipulative by being like, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry, so sorry. But like when it comes to actually doing something about it, she can't actually do a single thing about it, even though it's her literal company. Alexa tweeted a couple of things about this a while ago, and I think she took these down because I was scouring the internet trying to find them, but she shared a screenshot of a text from Christy about the situation. And I remember Christy just saying something about Lindsay Shaw and being, nervous about platforming her, and Lindsay's not as grateful as she should be for having this platform that Christy gave her, and Lindsay wasn't as grateful for the opportunity that Christy bestowed. And I can't say for sure what they said, so take this with a grain of salt, but I won't forget a part where Christy was like, I've never been in a position of power before. Please, have grace with me over. She didn't say have grace, but she was just sorry, I've never been in a position of power before. And I thought that was really interesting that she, could acknowledge her position of power, and the way she's choosing to use it is just has me asking a lot of questions and feels really manipulative. Like I said, there are so many more details about all of this in Alexa's YouTube videos, so I encourage you to watch them because I want you to hear the whole full story, not just my recounting of it, if you can, if you're interested. But I wanted to point out one last thing because I felt like this was culty and really dangerous for survivors that Christy would potentially have on her podcast, Vulnerable, where she's getting people to share her trauma. So Christy had Holly Madison on the podcast before she had Corey Feldman on. And obviously, Holly Madison talked about being with Hugh Hefner and being in Playboy and all of those things, and talked about how Hugh Hefner was abusive and manipulative in a lot of ways. Talk about culty, absolutely. And in the podcast episode interview with Corey Feldman, Corey started talking about how all the allegations against Hugh Hefner are not true, and how Hugh is a great guy and never did anything harmful or whatever. And Christy, who interviewed Hugh Hefner's literal survivor, agreed with Corey Feldman and was like, oh yeah, I never believed that stuff anyway, or something along those lines. Like I said, Alexa has the exact audio on her YouTube of exactly how Christy responded. And it just feels, I don't like when people switch it up like that. Are you advocating for survivors? Are you believing survivors? Are you holding space for the people you're having on your platform? Or are you not? Or are they potentially in danger of being further traumatized by you? Who are you being in front of everyone, behind the scenes, all the time, consistently? There seems to be no consistency with Christy. Christy has also platformed Todrick Hall on her Vulnerable podcast, who has also been accused of several horrible things and is also an alleged predator. And when people call her out publicly, she's real quick to pay attention and go take things down right away, but never addresses it, never says anything about it. And that is also a very controlling, that's very much information control and not a transparent or healthy move. And then last thing I want to mention with the Vulnerable podcast is I don't like the way she talked about or capitalized on Aaron Carter when he unalived himself. Christy was supposed to have Aaron on her podcast. Again, his trauma was trending at the time, and she talked about how he didn't show up. And she initially was like, oh, that's so unprofessional. Why would he do that? People need to get it together with their trauma and blah, blah, blah. And I thought, that was her first reaction, and she talked about that a lot. And then afterwards, she was like, oh, then I was really concerned. And my thought is, when you know you're bringing people onto your podcast that have endured horrible childhood trauma in very cult-like environments, that is bound to happen sometimes. The fact that your initial reaction is that's unprofessional and not great seems like someone who doesn't understand childhood trauma or these systems of power and control. She then made this whole episode about it after he passed and was like, oh, now I realize he was going through so much, and after a while I was so worried and I'm so sad for him and blah, blah, blah. So she still used his trauma for her gain. That one, after learning all of this and looking back on it, bothered me the most. Now, when I first made a couple quick TikTok videos about Christy, I had 3 different stories that I heard from people having not great things to say about her. 2 of them unconfirmed, absolutely take it with a grain of salt, but the other one I did confirm and get receipts for. So the first person said that Christy keeps reporting their TikTok account and trying to get this person's account taken down because they'll comment on some of Christy's videos about her past actions when she worked for Disney and how much of a bully she was, because this person's dad allegedly worked for Disney behind the scenes and she knew some of the things that Christy did back in the day and it was not great. Now, we're all different people as children than we are as adults, and that would be consistent. You know, a lot of times child stars, Allison Stoner talks about this in their Dear Hollywood podcast series and YouTube series. A lot of times child stars can develop really narcissistic behaviors because of the cult-like control and influence, and because they are told that they are really different, really special, etc., etc. So I get that. It's the deleting and blocking this person and trying to get their account taken down that I think is wild and really culty, instead of just like talking about it or addressing it or just ignoring it. Another person said they had a negative interaction with Christy and her husband Brendan in the DMs when she was doing the Walk and Talk Austin YouTube videos. She said she reached out to Christy because she had some either fat phobic or body shaming content that went up, and they said that Christy and Brendan were just really dismissive and really rude about it and did not acknowledge it or apologize or take it down or anything like that, and continued to post similar body shaming content. Now, the thing that I have receipts for happened way back when Christy started her YouTube channel back in 2019 and was doing Christy's Kitchen Throwbacks. So Christy Carlson Romano wanted to sell a cookbook when she did Christy's Kitchen Throwback based on the recipes she cooked with the other former child stars that she had on her YouTube channel. They did pre-sales as like a Kickstarter, I guess, but then allegedly, according to these receipts, they took over a year to not even produce the cookbook. I don't know that they have produced it to this day. The person who was giving me this information sent me this screenshot basically being like, it's been almost a year with no update except for Facebook comments saying that you're changing publishers. And Christy said it's being considered for purchase. The timeline is delayed, but you can get a refund if you want to because you've been waiting too long. So this person sent me confirmation of their purchase and a chain of emails trying to get the refund that they were promised. And they said they would Zelle this person a refund, but they never got the refund and also never got the cookbook. And allegedly other people have complained about this as well, but we are many years out from this and it just feels a little scammy. Informed consent is really important as a viewer, as a consumer of products or media, as even like survivors who want to go on certain platforms. It's important to have information available so that you can decide whether you want to follow someone, support something, go on their podcast. You like share your trauma with someone in a safe or unsafe place. Like, you need to have information and you need to have access to potential criticism from people who have had a bad experience in order for there to be consent to something. And the amount of times Christy has blocked and deleted anyone who has criticized her has been one of the biggest things that makes it feel culty and has given me the most concern, especially because this can be really dangerous and re-traumatizing for survivors if they trust her to go on her platform and are then harmed by it. Alexa Nicholas said this, and I tend to agree with her. I don't think Christy Carlson Romano is a terrible person, And I like to believe the best in people and give them the benefit of the doubt. So I don't think she's doing this maliciously. I think her husband has a lot to do with it as well. And we can't forget him in this conversation or his role in this conversation. We don't know how big or small his role is. So it's not entirely on Christy, but she is the public face of this, whether she has full control or not. And so a lot of the brunt of the optics of all of this falls on her, and she has to answer for a lot of it. I think she has good intentions. I think she wants the best for people, especially child stars. I think she wants to heal and move on from something. And sometimes it can be hard to do that when you're in the public eye or in the same systems of coercion and control and oppression that you were harmed in. I think maybe Christy hasn't fully deconstructed or unraveled the systems that of control that happened to her. And since she's never been part of any other system, she is perpetuating that harm, similar to the way that some victims of abuse sometimes perpetuate that abuse if they don't heal from it, learn from it, get help, etc. Some people have a different opinion, would be less forgiving for that. They think she is all about the money, all about the clicks, the views, the fame, the relevance, and think that she would do anything to keep that. And there is a little bit of her being malicious behind it, and maybe she doesn't even want to advocate for survivors. But I think this leads us to a bigger question that I hope we all consider. This is something that I think about a lot because I share survivor stories on my podcast and on my platform from time to time. I do it because I want to give a space for people to tell their story, and I try to be as survivor centered in that as I possibly can be. I have a lot of kind of rules or protocols that I follow to help people feel safe and have a safe space and tell their story on their terms. And I try to just give them the space and the tiny platform that I have to do that. But my question is, should we... I think sharing survivors' stories is important and powerful. I think it does bring awareness to issues and things that need to be talked about that we don't talk about in our society, especially with cults and cult-like groups and things like being a child star, being abused and it being covered up and people not getting justice. It's important to share these stories and spread this awareness. But where's the line between sharing these stories and giving your platform to this cause and taking advantage of the survivors who is the one telling their story? And do you think the people that are running these platforms, profiting off of these platforms, that are sharing these stories and traumas, do you think that they should be educated in the systems and the power dynamics and the coercive control and cult-like undue influence? Should we and they be, and trauma awareness, should we be educated at least a little bit in those areas before we have a platform like this so that we can do our best in being survivor-centered through it all? Do we think that should be something that we want to hear from influencers or personalities or former stars or current stars when there is traumatic incidents involved? I'm always wanting to listen and learn and understand and do the best that I can when I'm sharing someone else's story that isn't mine. And I think that this is a great conversation to have, a great question for us to ask, to go back and forth on with each other, and hopefully make it better for everyone moving forward. And ultimately, I want to hear from you. Do you follow Christy? Did you know any of this stuff? How do you feel now that you do know it? If you didn't before, does this change how you see Christy or the podcast or millennial nostalgia content in general, or content about child stars or trauma or cult survivors or SA survivors or survivors of systems of power and abuse and control? Leave your comment. I want to hear from you. Like, follow, subscribe wherever you're watching or listening, and I will see you in the next deep dive.